On today's episode, we're continuing our deep dive into the book and documentary about the legendary high school basketball team, the Dunbar Poets. Our guest today, Alijandro Danois, chronicled this team in his book, The Boys of Dunbar, and was in the documentary follow-up, Baltimore Boys. This corner of Hardwood History helps tell the story of basketball and the basketball culture we all enjoy today. It's also an American story and helps explain the difficulties of post-industrial cities and the game that helps some boys escape these difficult circumstances. Let's get into it.
This is amazing. When Michigan can keep this game to a 19-foot, 9-inch game inside that three-point line, it's all theirs. Nice move by Steve Fisher here. Turn it into the 19-9.
Welcome to the 19-9 podcast. Tonight's show, we're talking to Ali Danois, author of The Boys of Dunbar, a story of love, hope, and basketball. He's also in the documentary called Baltimore Boys, and is editor-in-chief of a website called The Shadow League, and probably a million other things. Welcome to the show, Ali.
Hey, no problem, man. No problem. Actually, the former editor-in-chief at Shadow League.
Okay, my bad. I was just Google, it can steer you wrong, so it's always nice to be checked on reality. So let's jump right in. I wanted to start right from the top and figure out how you came to be the documentarian of this, because it's just such a, it's such a great story. And it's just, I just was curious if it found you or if you were looking for something to write about, or what the intersection of this story was for you.
Sure. Yeah. It actually found me years prior. So I didn't grow up in Baltimore. I grew up in Brooklyn and New York City. And my buddies and I were basketball junkies. We had a court directly behind our building. Nice. And we spent an inordinate amount of hours back there playing, talking, arguing, debating. And so we're out there one day having one of our playground debates, and we're talking about, obviously, we're 10, 11, 12 years old, and, we think we know more than we do, and we're just really kind of arguing and making our case that New York City is the king of basketball. So, we're throwing out names like Tiny Archibald, who was from the South Bronx, right? And Dr. J, Julius Irving, who was from Long Island. And we're talking about all of these names, right? Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Connie Hawkins. And, there were guys a little bit older than us that we followed around to the playgrounds all over the city by the name of Dwayne the Pearl Washington, and Walter Berry, and Chris Mullen. And then there were also guys our own age who we were playing against in different tournaments by the name of Malik Sealy and Kenny Anderson and all of these great players. And there was a guy who lived in my building, and he was a magnificent playground basketball player. Had he had the mentality to actually go to school and do something with basketball, I have no doubt that he would have been a major Division I player, had an opportunity to play in the pros. He was about 6'6", had a sweet jumper, could handle the ball. I mean, he was incredible, but he chose to live a different lifestyle. So he's out there. He's always amused by us, right? And he was one of the guys that we would follow, and we would watch him play against Pearl Washington and Walter Berry and Chris Mullen and these guys. So he says, New York is the king of basketball, but the greatest team I ever saw was from Baltimore, Maryland. So we're like, wait a minute, the greatest team you ever saw? Because at this time, Magic Johnson and the Showtime Lakers are humming. Yeah. Dr. J is killing it with the Philadelphia 76ers. Bernard King is just creating magic every night at Madison Square Garden. And so we're like, the greatest team you ever saw? He said, I'm lying to you not. Greatest team I ever saw, a high school team from Baltimore, Maryland. They got the number one high school player in the country, but the crazy thing is he's not even the best player on his own team. So we're like, well, you're going to have to explain that, right? Because he's the number one player in the country, but he's not the best player on his own team. He's like, trust me, this guy, Reggie Williams, when he goes to college, he's 6'7", can handle the ball, can shoot, can rebound, can pass. Just magnificent, man. He is incredible. Wait till you see him in college. Okay, so if he's the number one player in the country and he's not the best player on his own team, then who's the best player? He says, you're not going to believe me. So we're like, come on, Mike, who's the best player? He says, you're not going to believe me. We're like, come on. So now we're thinking he's joking.
Yeah,
man,
sure.
you're full of whatever. So he says, dude, the best player on that team is a 5-foot midget, and his name is Bugsy. He called him Bugsy with a B. So then we really thought he was playing with us.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. The number one player in the country is not the best player on his own team. The best player is a 5-foot midget named Bugsy.
That sounds made up.
Right? So a couple of years later, I am tuned in to this innovative college sports television network with this idea of 24-hour sports programming.
Right.
And they fill a lot of those Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday nights with great college basketball games, ACC and the Big East.
Mm-hmm.
So I see Reggie Williams at Georgetown. I'm like, that's Reggie Williams. That's the guy Mike was telling me about. Right? And so Reggie obviously wins a national championship as a freshman at Georgetown. He is the most valuable player of the national championship game, gives Hakeem Olajuwon and Phi Slamma Jamma some work.
Gives it to him.
1 year out of Dunbar High School, right?
Yeah.
And so then I'm like, then I learn as I'm watching this that David Wingate was his teammate. So I'm starting to put these pieces together.
Yeah.
Now, I received a scholarship for talented minority students. So I left New York to go to a prep school up in Massachusetts outside of Boston. So being the hoops junkie that I was, you could go down to the Boston Garden and you could watch some great college basketball games.
Nice.
And there was this guy at Northeastern by the name of Reggie Lewis who was unbelievable. And then I found out that he was on this Dunbar team that I'd heard about. So one night, I'm in my dormitory common room, and I'm watching an ACC game. I'm glued to the television, and I watch Wake Forest. And I see the most revolutionary basketball talent I've ever seen in my life, 5'3" Muggsy Bogues, who could control a basketball game without scoring a point. And I jumped out of my seat when I made the connection, and I screamed to nobody, "That's Bugsy! That's Bugsy!" And the guys who were in that television common room just looked at me with like shreds of sympathy, like, this dude is nuts.
He lost it. He lost it.
Right?
Oh,
so now I put those pieces together.
Yeah.
And so, back then I followed the box scores.
Right.
So I would get the Boston Globe every morning, and I would look at the box scores to see how many assists Muggsy had, to see how much Reggie scored, to see how much, and I had the opportunity to actually physically see Reggie Lewis when he was at Northeastern, coached by the great Jim Calhoun.
Mm-hmm.
And so, just to see Georgetown win that national championship, to see what Muggsy did at Wake Forest, to see what Reggie did at Northeastern, and then to see them all go into the pros, that story always kind of stayed with me.
Yeah.
And then I moved to Baltimore about 20 years ago, and I had started doing some work for the Baltimore Sun. They had a great high school sports section at the time. So now I'm starting to navigate my way around Baltimore, and now I'm in these gyms, right?
Yeah.
I'm in the Lake Clifton gym. I'm in the Dunbar gym. And it was like looking at those banners and seeing those names, and like the ghosts were just talking to me. And so I had this idea, like, hey, I think this would be a great story. And I didn't initially think of it as a book or a 30 for 30 documentary. I just wanted to write a story about the greatest high school basketball team of all time and put some of those kind of elements and those pieces together. And it actually started out as an idea for a magazine story. So I reached out to an editor at Sports Illustrated and sent him about a 2 to 3 paragraph pitch. And he got back in touch with me and said, man, this is a fantastic idea, but right now, we're really not farming out stories to freelance guys. And if it's not really the A-list guys, just to be honest with you, they're probably not going to bite on it, but you've got a really great idea here. And so I was like, okay.
How old are you at this time?
Let's see. I had just gotten to Baltimore, had been here for a while. So I want to say this is around 2006, maybe.
Yeah. So it's like pre-internet. So it's like now you'd almost think about like figuring out how to, you could even just put it up yourself or something like that. But like, that's so ambitious. How did you even think did you have to like reach out to Sports Illustrated, or how did you even like think of that? Like, you've got a good story, but you're just like, I'm going to write to Sports Illustrated.
I reached out to them, just sending an email in the blind. And I actually had a buddy of mine who was a writer who had done a couple of tennis stories for Sports Illustrated.
So you got a little connection.
He said, hey, this is the editor that I've worked with.
Yeah.
I'll let him know that you're going to reach out.
Okay, that's cool.
But what he did for me, which was something he didn't have to do, and it made such an impression on me, and it's why, I always try to, if I can, help other people out in this business, because it's a very tough business, magazine writing, newspaper writing, just sports writing in general. People kind of look at TV and they see these bulbous-headed personalities yelling and screaming, and they think it's easy to do it, right? But Stephen A. Smith started out writing about high school sports for the New York Daily News, and worked his tail off all the way up through the Philadelphia Inquirer before he got a shot to be on TV, right? So it's kind of really difficult. But what the guy at Sports Illustrated did for me, unbeknownst to me, was he reached out to an agency that represented writers. And so I got a phone call from a guy, and he said, hey, I'm from XYZ agency. Chris from Sports Illustrated sent us your pitch. We want to talk to you. So I called him back, and they said, we really like this story, and we think it's much more than a magazine story. Do you think you can turn your 3-paragraph pitch into a 60-page book proposal? And I said, well, does, Bigfoot defecate in the woods? Let's do it. I didn't think it was a book, right?
Yeah.
I wasn't even thinking that big. But
did you have enough material? I mean, like, were you? I mean, to hear that would be super exciting, but also that's like one of those things you say yes immediately and then maybe freak out afterwards a little bit, like,
and
excited.
Then you're humbled, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And because I wasn't a huge name, and I didn't have a previous book under my belt, they were like, we're just going to have to make this irresistible. Right now, mind you, I've got a full-time job, a part-time job, I've got kids, I'm just trying to scratch and stay afloat and survive. So, I had to work on this thing whenever I had an opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I heard a saying the other day that if you want something done, give it to a busy person. So that's, I wrote that one down because I like that.
Yeah. I'm going to write that down too, man.
Yep.
And so people don't understand when I tell them that the whole process from starting the book proposal to actually getting the book published took 10 years. Gosh. Right? And 5 years of that was actually working on the proposal.
Wow.
And then the next 5 years of it was actually writing the book.
Wow. So walk me through the proposal, because one of my questions was I was listening to Bruce Springsteen be interviewed the other day by Malcolm Gladwell and Rick Rubin, and they're talking to him about music and lyrics. And there's a lot of the way that you write, because it's so descriptive. I'm thinking of music and lyrics, and I'm just thinking where do you start to go through? Because newspaper articles and box scores, they're not painting a picture like you do of these games. I watched the documentary, and I love the documentary too. And there is some footage in there so you can watch the guys in action. But I enjoyed the descriptions of the games as much, because it just filled in a lot of those holes. And I was thinking though, reading it, okay, where do you get this? Because that isn't in the box scores, the way that you're talking about Muggsy and stuff like that. So where'd you start, lyrics or music? Where did you start to paint this picture?
Well, I had to first come up with an outline, right, of what the story was. And so in my mind, I wanted this story to start at the first day of practice. But I knew that it really went well before then, right? It went into the incubator systems of the Baltimore City recreation centers. It went into the childhoods of these players. It went into the classrooms and the hallways. It wasn't just about the basketball. I needed to capture kind of who these people were. And so what really was helpful to me was living in Baltimore. I didn't live too far from the main library branch on Cathedral Street. So I would go down and I would just read the microfilm of the Baltimore Sun, the Baltimore African American, and then there was another Baltimore paper that's escaping me at the time. But there were two daily newspapers, and then you had the Afro American paper as well. So what I did was I just started reading. I took a 2-year window, right? And not just the sports section, because I wanted to get a sense and a feel for what life was like in the early 1980s in Baltimore, right? From
Definitely.
An economic perspective, from a blue-collar worker perspective, to a local political perspective, to a sports perspective, to a cultural and arts perspective. And then I really just honed in on those stories about the basketball games, because one of the things about Baltimore is high school basketball is huge here.
Right.
And so those newspapers really did a great job of covering those teams and really making you feel like you were at those games. So I had access to the box scores, and because that team was so dominant, all of their games were basically in the paper, right? Which you won't find,
from that era,
from a team that's just, not that good.
Yeah.
But because they were that good, and those sports editors really understood what was happening, they really opened up a window to me. And then, so I had those resources. And then, like I said, I was, doing some work with the Baltimore Sun's high school sports section. And so I'm passing Bob Wade at some of these games. I'm passing Herman Tree Hareed, who was one of the great players, Muggsy and Reggie's senior year. Tree transferred in from another high school. So I started to form relationships with the people who were part of this team and just talk to them. And, eventually, once I got to the proposal stage and figured out, I had an opportunity to really do something significant with it, they were very supportive in terms of telling me their story.
I love that. And I think there's something about this book. You hit on it there a little bit. And the documentary starts out with the riots, but bringing in the city of Baltimore helps to just, I don't know if it's deepen is the right way to say it, but it definitely rounds out the story of it. It gives this context to not just about the games, but the lives that these players were living. And it makes it feel so like such a modern story. I think that sometimes when I read, sports stories when I was younger, it would just be about the games, and you miss out on that context so much about what these guys went through to achieve what they achieved. And it makes the story more exciting and memorable, and sometimes even heartbreaking, some of the things that they had to go through.
Yeah, I mean, living in Baltimore really helped because I understood that the city was going to be just as much of a main character as Bob Wade was, as Muggsy Bogues was, as the other players were. Just because it's a really fascinating city. It's the northernmost city of the South. It's the southernmost city of the North. It has this great history of the shipyards and just so much around the blue collar wage and the economy. And Baltimore played a really, really big part in the early evolution of the country. So I really kind of understood what Baltimore meant. I understood the values and the work ethic. And I understood, walking the streets and going to those gyms and being in those hallways of those schools, what sports can mean to a community that's really, really struggling. And then when you put that in context with, these guys from 81 to 1983 is when crack just explodes on the scene. And even prior to that, I mean, that East Baltimore community was a very difficult community to come up in. But what I wanted people to understand is that even within those, struggling pockets of despair, there's love, man. There's like mentorship. There's so much that goes on in the school systems and the recreation centers and the mentors and the youth league coaches, right? And so it's not just this barren desert of death and killing and drugs, man. It's like real people with real talent, with real intellect, with real drive, who were part of, the civil rights movement, not by reading it in a book, but by actually being a part of it, And so you just had all of these different elements. And I think I got really fortunate, Aaron, that I kind of stumbled upon a story that, because initially, I thought I was writing a basketball story, right? The greatest basketball high school team of all time.
Well, maybe if it had been just an article in a magazine, that you might have had to focus on that. The opportunity to write a book about this, it just opens up so many avenues to explore these guys' lives in more depth. It's like the difference between a movie or a 10-part series on Netflix or something like that.
Yep. So I think I got really fortunate. I kind of stumbled upon something that I saw the emerging power and the potential of the more I started working on it. So, the more excited I got about it. And then what was really cool and interesting was, I was interviewing the players individually, but I felt like something was missing. And so what we started to do, we would have these group conference calls, man, and that's when all the jokes came out. That's when all of the stories were like, oh, I forgot about that when we were at the Harlem Y, and I was afraid to go to the bathroom, so I took a piss out the window, and that's when all of the really cool magic began to happen, and that was a huge challenge, right? You're trying to reconstruct something that happened 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But, to get those guys together and just to hear the laughter and to hear the story and to hear the love that they still have, not only for one another, but their principal, Mrs. Woodland, right?
Yeah.
Or
How you doing? How you doing, baby? That chapter,
Yep. Every student, how you doing, baby? Knew everybody by name and pulled them to the side and said, I talked to your mother last night. And that was another really cool and interesting thing, that this was a multi-generational thing, right? So Bob Wade knew Muggsy and Reggie Williams' parents before they were even born, right? Because he was a star player at Dunbar. All of their family members had gone to Dunbar. So it wasn't like he just had these really cool basketball players. Like, there really was this extended sense of family, right? And a buying into the philosophy of the team is bigger than just one individual, right?
Yeah.
So, Bob Wade had a neighbor who was an accountant. Reggie Williams would work at the store that Bob Wade owned. So on the weekends, he would stay over at Coach Wade's house. Yeah. And the neighbor would come over to tutor him in math, right?
Right.
And that was just kind of one example of the love and the family. Like, those guys would sit down and eat dinner together before they ever showed a hint of promise. Like, Muggsy and Reggie Williams were best friends before they ever picked up a basketball. So can you imagine, like, just having that sense of seeing these guys as kids in the recreation center playing checkers and running around and grabbing on the back of city buses on roller skates, and then they discover this magical round orange ball that takes them all over the world.
Yeah, crazy. Yeah, because a lot of them, too, you talk about were into baseball. It was a bigger thing at the time. And I was just reading John Thompson's book, too. I Came as a Shadow, and he's really into baseball, too. So it was more of at the time, more of a thing to be into baseball rather than basketball. And some of them wanted initially to be baseball players.
Yeah. Baseball was huge in the African American community, and Baltimore had one of the really, really good Negro League baseball teams, right? So, those guys' uncles, their fathers, their grandfathers, they all played baseball.
Yeah, that's crazy. So I'm curious, the high school game, Indiana, we love our high school basketball around here, but I was curious if you could get a sense, even New York City high school basketball is huge too. So I'm curious what you found out or what you think about why is high school basketball in particular so big in Baltimore? What is it about the high school game that connects it to the city?
Well, I think it's connected to a sense of pride that people have for their schools, for their neighborhoods, because they're not just representing themselves, right? So as I mentioned, Muggsy's older sister, Sharon, she was a phenomenal basketball player at Dunbar High School who, had she been born today, probably would have played at a major college program and had an opportunity to play in the WNBA or overseas. She was the one who taught him the game, right? So his parents went there, his aunts and uncles went there, his older brothers went there. There was this sense of pride that you had when you put on that uniform, and it's a power. And that was one of the things that struck me when I moved to Baltimore. One of the first things people asked you was, where'd you go to school? But they weren't talking about college.
Yeah.
They were talking about your high school.
Yeah.
Right? And that was kind of the first question. And then everything else kind of flowed from there. And it's still that way today, just this sense of pride that the schools have.
That moment.
And, Baltimore is not a huge city like New York. 600,000 people, maybe, the borough of Brooklyn is bigger than Baltimore. Queens is bigger than Baltimore, right? So you have this kind of small community that's connected in many ways, and sports has always kind of been something that kind of elevated folks who were kind of going through some not so pleasant experiences. And that was one of the things that really struck me when I wrote the book. And talking to some of the older people, when they would say, like, I didn't know how I was going to pay my gas and electric bill. I didn't know how I was going to pay my rent. I didn't know how I was going to put groceries on the table. But for that 2 hours, when I paid $3 to walk into that Dunbar gym and I got to see that team, I forgot all of my troubles. And I walked out of that gym feeling like there was hope and happy and energized, like, okay, it's going to be all right. And that's a pretty incredible thing, to explain to people who don't understand the power and majesty of sports. Right? It's so much bigger than the final score.
Community.
And that's one of the things that I like to do as a writer is I'm not going to go to cover the game. And I love to watch the games.
Right.
But to me, the power is the story behind the story.
So we were talking about Coach Wade, and I was just curious about, where you started with him and what he was like. What were your impressions of him?
So as I mentioned before, I was doing some work with, the Baltimore Sun high school sports section, and I had come across Coach and some of the different gyms and, the football games and stuff. And when I had this idea, I ran it by a buddy of mine who had been a longtime writer at the Baltimore Sun. And he said, Coach Wade does not trust reporters. He doesn't trust journalists because of what happened at the University of Maryland. He said, but I think I can kind of talk to him and make an introduction, and at least he will give you a fair listen. But just to let you know, he's kind of known for being abrasive to some folks and not very trusting, right? That was the reputation. So, my buddy had a relationship with him, and he introduced me to him, and we had a chance to kind of sit down, and, I laid out what it is that I wanted to do, and, he was in support of it. And he was just such a fascinating character, and he's probably the glue that holds this story together, because he was a product of Dunbar himself. He was a great athlete. He was the starting quarterback on the football team. He was a serviceable sixth man on the basketball team. He was drafted by the Cincinnati Reds as a baseball player. He went on to play in the National Football League. But he was adamant that he wanted to have the same influence on his community and on young people through the power of athletics that his high school coach, the legendary William Sugar Kane, had on him. So while Wade was playing in the National Football League, he was coming back in the summer to attain his teaching certification. And, when he had to abruptly retire from the NFL because he shattered his hand, and for all intents and purposes, having a shattered hand as a defensive back, especially back then when the medical technology was not what it is today, he knew what he wanted to do. And so just to think about the number of lives that he affected at Dunbar, because he just wasn't the basketball coach. He was the football coach. He was the baseball coach. He had a huge influence and personality in that building that went beyond whatever happened in the gymnasium.
Yeah, there's depth, real depth to his involvement in these guys' lives too. He's not just coach and then they go home. Like, he knows what they're doing after school. Like you said, he's got them coming over on the weekends, helping out with jobs, and just he has this a level of understanding of his players that is just that. You almost would have had to have come from there, right? To know what these guys need to reach the success. And like you said, maybe he got that from his coach, had the blueprint laid out for him a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And he was very serious about understanding, because he had come from those same streets, right? But he also understood that in his day, you showed you were the toughest guy by using your fists, right? That kind of graduated towards knives, right? And then maybe an occasional, gun being fired here and then. But now he is navigating in a situation where, because the drug trade takes over to the way that it does, you got semi-automatic, powerful rifles. You got bloodshed in the streets, innocent victims. When he was coming up, the criminal element kind of kept things to themselves, right? They stayed away from the schools and the senior citizens, and it was kind of a self-contained thing. But when those profit margins really exploded and those powerful weapons got in the hands of 13 and 14 and 15-year-old kids that didn't have discipline, it was a very kind of bizarre place for him to understand, this is the place that I love, this is the place that I'm from, and how can I help these kids that have some promise, get out of here and get an opportunity to see and do other things. And, you just don't find that today on those levels of basketball, because I'm sure you understand what happens now on the elite kind of levels of basketball on the AAU and the high school level. The high school coach is about important as the third period biology teacher.
Yeah, I can't be involved. They're just kind of removed from these guys' lives in different ways, especially at that level.
It's the AAU coach that's got all the juice.
Yep.
What sneaker company are you affiliated with, right? There's a handler, there's so much stuff that goes on.
Yeah.
And that was just a different time, right? Before the big money moved into summer basketball, when the high school season really meant something. And that's how the story was passed down to me, because an older guy that lived in my building in Brooklyn, New York, went to the Harlem Holiday Classic at City College and saw this talent by the name of Muggsy Bogues that just blew his mind. And that's how the story initially got told to me in real time. And then, as I talked before about reading the box scores and going to see Reggie Lewis at Northeastern and seeing the Georgetown National Championship and seeing Muggsy at Wake Forest, and then to see what they did in the NBA, you don't see it now so much in terms of the high school coach. Not that there aren't high school coaches with that same level of passion and that same want and desire to help these kids, But Wade was the guy who had all the juice. He was the one taking him to 5-star over the summer. He was the one handling recruitment because he understood how things could kind of get out of hand with some of these families that didn't understand, or some of these kids that could get swayed by a few quick bucks. So he was a father to guys that had fathers, right? But to the guys that didn't have fathers in their lives, the role he played, you can't even quantify it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you hit on a couple of things there. One, I gotta do a quick aside here. Does Baltimore, you're from Brooklyn, so does Baltimore have the best nicknames in history? Because you've got Honey Dip in there, which is an incredible nickname, and you mentioned Sugar, Muggsy, and I want to talk about Truck here in a minute too. But just personal opinion, Brooklyn or New York City versus Baltimore. Who's got better nicknames? Because those are some amazing ones.
It's got to be Baltimore, man. It's got to be Baltimore,
it's
right?
Unbelievable.
Because, these guys, they get their nicknames when they're kids, and it sticks with them their whole life, right? So,
I was dying with some of these guys.
He got his nickname because he was stealing the ball from everybody on the court when he was a little kid, and they watched the Bowery Boys on television, and they said, "Man, you like that guy from the Bowery Boys? You mugging everybody out there." Right?
Oh man,
Truck got his nickname because he had the appetite of a garbage truck, right? And that just stuck with him since he was a little kid.
So great.
Yeah. As much as I love New York City and I love Brooklyn, Baltimore is a special place, especially as it relates to people's nicknames, and they get them when they're very young and they stick with them for life.
Yeah, and we won't go into it now, but I think some of the stuff you said about the difficult things in Baltimore, Honey Dip, Skip Wise, who maybe was the best player in Baltimore history, not on this team, but he talked about his career and just super fascinating. Had me in doing deep dives into the books that you shouted out to, the Terry Pluto book and Caught in the Net. Just that whole aside is unbelievable. I would encourage everyone to read the book and get to that story too. But before we wrap up tonight, I wanted to talk a little bit about Reggie Lewis, because he becomes a real focal point in the documentary, and it is crazy to think about that he is the sixth man on this team, and he seems like such a modern player too. Like his telling, or the way that you tell it about him kind of wanting to be a wing player. And I mean, Reggie Williams and David Wingate too, like they look like modern players. It is incredible. Like these guys are huge. I'm early 80s, 6'7", 6'8", and they just could move and dunk and dribble. Unbelievable. But tell me a little bit about Reggie Lewis and just where you started with him, because that's a different end point. Obviously, wouldn't have been able to just talk to him as much or get him in with those other guys. So just a different kind of.
And that was tough, right? Because to really flesh Reggie out, you had to depend on the memories, right, of the other guys, right? So, they would talk about his personality, and they knew him before he got to Dunbar from the neighborhood, but he'd been cut by the Patterson coach, right? And his coach at the recreation center called up Wade and said, "Look, man, I got this kid. I don't know what's going on with the coach at Patterson, because Truck's older brother was a star player. Irvin was a star player at Patterson. But he got cut from the team for whatever reason. And he says, look, I'm going to send him to Dunbar. I think the best place for him to be is to be with you." And Wade calls him back after first checking him out in the summer leagues and said, "Man, that coach at Patterson must be an idiot, because there's no way you're supposed to cut that kid." And he was very humble. And he walked into a situation again where guys had established reputations. He had yet to fully establish himself as a great player in the city. But in those practices, he showed people, and Wade, could be abrasive at times, right? So, there were times where he rode Reggie and said, well, you can't shoot. I'm not going to play you at guard, or you can't dribble, or you can't pass. And this guy would stay in the gym by himself late at night, right, setting up obstacle courses with chairs and cones and shooting drills. And the most fascinating thing about it is when you look at the trajectory of this team, he was the sixth man, right? He didn't even start on this team, but when you go up and you see him as the captain of the Boston Celtics, giving Michael Jordan the business, he became the best one out of all of them.
Yeah, crazy. So incredible. Man,
a lot of stuff in there, man. A lot of stuff in there.
Okay, so I got two more before I let you go, and I just want to thank you again for coming on tonight. It's been a few years since these came out, so writers are always like wanting to add something else. Like you have to turn in the manuscript at some point, and you had 10 years, so you're working on it for a long time. So I'm sure maybe you're ready to just give it up. But I'm curious now that you've had some time away from it, is there something that you would add, or what would you change about it? Just if you had a kind of addendum to it, or a reprint or something like that.
I don't really think I would add anything to it because, one of the things that I tell people is you really have to read the book and then watch the documentary, right? Because they're separate entities.
Yeah, so I agree.
The book takes place in one high school season.
Yep.
There's a lot of history, right? We learn about the great Skip Wise, the greatest basketball player to this day. Anyone from Baltimore will tell you, man, Carmelo Anthony is Hall of Famer. He's amazing. He's incredible. But he wasn't Skip.
Yeah.
And no one is, or no one probably will ever be the great Skip Wise, right?
Yeah.
You got all of those history of the recreation centers and what those meant to the development of these kids and their talent. And you just got, so much in terms of the families and Bob Wade and, just what Dunbar means and what these kids mean to these people who come in to watch these games. So, the book was 1 year. 1981, 1982. The documentary goes through their high school, their college, and their NBA. Right, so it's different. So when people tell me, "Hey, man, I saw the documentary, that was great," now I don't have to read the book. I'm like, no, you gotta read the book because it's different. It's a 100%. Different, story.
Yes, for sure.
But I don't think I would add anything. Like it's something that I look back on now, and I don't have any gnawing things like, oh, I should have said this or I missed this part of it. It's like
that's good.
Now I just don't have any sense of, man, I wish. I will say that one thing I do wish, we interviewed John Thompson.
Yeah.
For the 30 for 30, and unfortunately, the way the paperwork trail and stuff, by the time things were going through edits and the film was getting ready to air, they still hadn't had the release form from him, and for whatever reason, that just got delayed and it didn't happen. But I sat down and I interviewed Coach Wade for a couple of hours on the campus at Georgetown, and he admitted to me that the biggest mistake he ever made as the coach at Georgetown was not listening to Bob Wade, who told him to recruit Muggsy as their point guard. He was like, but he's just so small. He's a great high school player. I just can't see it. And he looked me in the eye and said, if I had Muggsy with Patrick Ewing, Reggie Williams, and David Wingate, he said, I would have won 3 national championships.
It's over. Just mail it in. That would have been so
that's the only thing I would look at in terms of like these two kind of these family projects of what was missing. I really wish folks could have seen him say that.
Yeah, we didn't even get into Wingate, but he, you tell it in there about his recruitment too with Coach Thompson. Just so incredible to hear about like what it must have been like to have John Thompson showing up in people's houses in the early 80s to recruit these guys too, because he's just such a legendary figure now, but he's just getting started then. Yeah. So
he was just getting started back then. They hadn't won a national championship. David Wingate said, I didn't even know where Georgetown, I didn't even know they had a basketball team. Like, we never saw them on TV.
Well,
when this man, when he walks into your living room and he sits down at the table talking to your mother and your father, and you're like, okay. This was Bill Russell's backup with the Boston Celtics, and he's like, I'm going to take care of your kid. I'm going to make sure he gets educated, but if he doesn't do what he's supposed to do, I'm sending his ass back.
Well, had to be like kind of a comforting thing too, like for coming from Coach Wade, just seems like a natural extension of him in some ways, you know, just like same type of character.
And that's what those guys said, that, you know, Reggie, that it's funny, like one of the things he said when he went to Georgetown, and after the first couple practices, like he was doing everything so easy, and John Thompson pulled him aside and was like, you know, he said, man, this ain't nothing compared to what we went through at Dunbar practice. So I'm ready.
I know.
They were similar.
Similar.
They were similar personalities in terms of, you know, being concerned African-American professional men who really wanted to give these kids an opportunity to survive and understand that the ball is going to stop bouncing someday. Right. So, they wanted to win. They won championships. They did some incredible things as athletes. But like when you look at all of those guys now, like a lot of them have been involved, if they're not still involved, in coaching and mentoring kids.
Yeah. No, there's no doubt. There's no doubt about it. I mean, some of the like smaller details are so incredible, talking about the study tables that Coach Wade put in, and John Thompson too, same thing. Like he didn't play with guys' grades. Like that was so important to him. And, you know, you mentioned the practices, and there's just too much to talk about, but I definitely encourage people to read the book. And I think you're right. Like now that you say it, that really locked into me, because that's the order that I went. I read the book and then watched the documentary, and the documentary feels a little bit like an extension, even though it retells some of the stories in there. It feels like a little bit of an extension to the book, telling some of their college and pro careers. And honestly, the 5-star magazine that Slam put out too, you've got some of the story about Muggsy going to 5-star and Coach Wade being up there. That in itself is an incredible story about that the way that they drafted players. Oh my gosh.
Yep. There's some really cool, like lighthearted stories, right? Like the trip to New York and staying in the YMCA,
man,
right?
So good, yeah.
The trip to Pennsylvania, and just, you know, some of the fun, lighter moments of, you know, when these guys were just kids.
Yeah,
you know?
Just cracking up. Yeah. For sure.
Yep.
So before we go then, last thing, what do you got going on? Tell us what you got going on now, because if there is stuff that you can tell us about, because I'm excited to hear what you got coming out next.
Sure. I can't give you details on this one project, but I'm ghostwriting something in the basketball space that folks are really going to be interested in. I'm working on, I've got a proposal for another sports book. It's not going to be strictly basketball, but it's going to be kind of a New York story, and it's going to be around basketball and boxing. And, some just really kind of important, elemental kind of moments. And then I'm working on some more film proposals. Both of those would be kind of high school and college basketball related. So I'm hoping to get a couple of other, if not ESPN 30 for 30s, you know, maybe something on HBO or Showtime or Netflix to tell some of these stories. So I got a little bit of something going on, both in the writing and the producing and hopefully some film stuff. And, you know, who knows? I will definitely keep you abreast, and love talking to you, man. Had a great time talking about the 5-star project with you guys. And I love what you guys do, and best believe you'll be the first one to know when I can talk about something that's ready to go.
Can't wait. Well, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Aaron, I appreciate you, man. Anytime you need me, you know where to find me.
All right, man. Thank you for listening to the 19.9 podcast. If you haven't already subscribed to the podcast, make sure you do. And while you're at it, leave us a rating or review. It helps keep us going. We also have links to all of 19.9 social media so you never miss a release. Until next time.